Moses was born 3,300 years ago in ancient Egypt, one of the most historical places in the Bible. According to the Bible, the people of Israel settled in Egypt. That's why Jacob and Joseph's descendants grew in number. For a long time, the Egyptians were thankful to Joseph for saving their land from a great disaster. Because of this, his people were treated well. But after Joseph died, things started to change for the Hebrews. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would grow. That's exactly what happened. The Hebrew population in Egypt increased quickly, and they became strong and influential. Then a new pharaoh came to power, one who didn't know about Joseph or how he had helped Egypt. The pharaoh saw the growing number of Hebrews as a threat. He feared that they might become too powerful and take over Egypt. To control them, he forced the Israelites into hard labor. Even though they were treated harshly, they kept multiplying. Pharaoh then made life even harder for them, turning them into slaves and giving them the toughest and most tiring jobs. No matter how much they suffered, the Israelites continued to grow in number, just as God had promised Abraham. Being frustrated, the Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill all newborn Hebrew boys. The midwives refused because they didn't want to destroy their own people. When the Pharaoh asked why Hebrew babies were still being born, they told him that Hebrew women were strong and had their babies before the midwives could even arrive. Angry, Pharaoh made a terrible decision. All newborn Hebrew boys had to be thrown into the Nile River, while only the baby girls could live. Fear spread among the Hebrews. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were taken from them. But one woman from the tribe of Levi refused to give up her baby boy. She hid him for 3 months, but as he grew, it became harder to keep him a secret. Desperate to save him, she placed him in a basket made of reeds and set it afloat on the Nile River, praying for God's protection. The baby's sister followed the basket along the river, watching over him. By God's plan, the basket drifted to the very place where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. She noticed the basket among the reeds and told her servant to bring it to her. As she peered into the basket, the Pharaoh's daughter gasped in astonishment. Nestled inside was a strikingly beautiful infant. There was no doubt. Every sign suggested that this child was of Hebrew descent. Nevertheless, she decided to adopt the child and named him after Moses, since he had been saved from the waters. The child would then grow up among the highest Egyptian nobility, not knowing that an even more glorious fate awaited him. Moses was rescued from the Nile by the princess, the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. She took him in as her own, raising him within the opulent halls of Egyptian nobility. However, the princess needed someone to nurse the child, so a Hebrew woman was summoned to care for him. But guess what? This woman was none other than his biological mother. As an Egyptian prince, Moses lived a life of luxury and prestige. Yet as he grew older, a deep curiosity stirred within him. He longed to witness firsthand the reality of the Hebrew people, his own lineage. What he saw left him shaken. The Hebrews lived under cruel oppression, forced into hard labor. One day, Moses came upon an Egyptian overseer mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. Overcome with fury, he struck the Egyptian down, resulting in the man's death. Word of Moses' crime spread swiftly, reaching the Pharaoh's ears. The ruler, enraged, ordered Moses' capture. With no other choice, Moses fled to Midian, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Now a wanderer, Moses encountered a group of young women struggling to water their flock, hindered by a band of shepherds. Stepping in, he defended the women and ensured their animals could drink. Grateful for his help, the women introduced Moses to their father, Reuel, who welcomed him into his home. In time, he offered Moses one of his daughters in marriage. Moses settled in the land of Midian, where he and his wife built a new life together. They had a son, Gershom, and lived in peace. Meanwhile, the suffering of the Israelites under Egyptian rule only worsened. A new pharaoh had taken the throne, and his reign was even harsher than his predecessors. The Hebrew people cried out for deliverance, pleading for their Creator's aid. God did not turn a deaf ear to the suffering of Abraham's descendants. He had not forgotten his covenant with the Israelites. One day, while tending to his flock near Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Moses witnessed something extraordinary. A bush engulfed in flames, yet untouched by the fire. Being curious, he approached only to hear a voice calling out to him. It was no one but God himself. God spoke. "I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." God declared that he had descended to answer the cries of his chosen people. and Moses would serve as his instrument to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses hesitated. He was an ordinary man. How could he possibly command the attention of anyone, let alone a mighty Pharaoh? To strengthen his faith, God instructed Moses to cast his staff onto the ground. As soon as it touched the earth, to Moses' astonishment, it transformed into a serpent. Then at God's command, he reached out and grasped it by the tail, and in an instant, it became a staff once more. This miracle alone would prove to the Israelites that God was with Moses, guiding their path to freedom. Yet God did not stop there. He revealed other signs to Moses, ensuring that the people of Abraham would recognize his divine mission. Despite witnessing these wonders, Moses still doubted. He insisted he was not eloquent, that his speech was not strong enough to lead. But God reassured him, promising that he would always be with him, giving him the words to speak. To support him further, God sent Aaron, Moses' brother, to stand by his side as his spokesman. Together, the two brothers set out for Egypt, carrying the divine mandate to free God's people. Upon returning from his long exile in Midian, Moses, once a prince of Egypt, stood before the Israelite elders. At his sign was Aaron, well respected among their people. They gathered the leaders and revealed God's plan for liberation. To prove the truth of his words, Moses demonstrated the miraculous signs that God had given him. The Hebrews witnessing these wonders believed that he was truly God's chosen envoy. But the Pharaoh would not be so easily swayed. Moses and Aaron stood before the ruler of Egypt and declared God's command. Moses asked the Pharaoh to set his people free, but Pharaoh denied that proposal. He would not release the Israelites from bondage. Moses warned him that if he defied God's will, Egypt would suffer great plagues. But instead of yielding, the Pharaoh hardened his heart further. As a result, he made the burdens of the Hebrews even more unbearable. He decreed that no straw would be provided for brick making. Yet the slaves were still expected to meet the same production quota. Their labor grew harsher, their suffering deeper, but God's plan for deliverance had already begun. Moses was deeply troubled to see that his people's suffering had only intensified since his return. However, God commanded him to stand before Pharaoh once more, armed with divine signs to prove that he was God's chosen messenger. Before the mighty ruler, Aaron cast Moses' staff to the ground, and in an instant, it transformed into a serpent. But it ended in vain as Pharaoh's sorcerers, relying on their mystical arts, mimicked the act, turning their rods into snakes. However, in a display of God's supreme power, Moses' serpent devoured the others. Even so, Pharaoh remained rigid at his decision. Once again, Moses and Aaron had failed to persuade him to release God's people. But the Creator knew Pharaoh's heart would not yield willingly. The time had come for Egypt to feel the weight of divine power, a force so great that even Pharaoh would have no choice but to relent. Then calamity struck Egypt. One by one, the plagues descended upon the land, 10 devastating signs of God's might. The first 9 displayed his dominion over nature, over diseases, and over the very kingdom Pharaoh ruled. But the 10th would be the most dreadful of all. This final plague was not merely a display of power, it was a judgment, a reckoning. It was a demonstration that God alone holds authority over life and death. And just like that, on a fateful night, God took the life of every firstborn in Egypt who did not place their trust in him. That night, the Israelites were set free by God's mighty hand and led out of bondage under a pillar of fire. But God was not finished revealing his glory. As Pharaoh's army pursued them, the Israelites found themselves trapped between the oppressors and the vast, impassable waters of the Red Sea. Yet God commanded Moses to raise his staff, and at once, the wind surged, parting the waters into towering walls. On dry ground, the people of God crossed safely to the other side. But as soon as the Egyptian forces followed, the sea crashed back upon them, delivering justice after 400 years of suffering. Now free, the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness under Moses' leadership, slowly being shaped into a new nation. To guide them, God gave them a set of laws, moral, civic, and ceremonial, that were meant to draw them closer to him. Their obedience was meant to be an act of gratitude for their salvation. But instead of faithfulness, the people fell into rebellion, idolatry, and discontent. Moses, once the devoted messenger of God, let his temper get the best of him. Instead of following God's commands to speak to the rock, he struck it twice in frustration. This act of disobedience cost him dearly. He was barred from entering the promised land, and just like that, Even after trying hard, he couldn't enter the promised Holy Land. That's how time passed, and with that, his journey had reached its end. But Moses was a key figure in biblical history, serving as a prophet, priest, and leader. Yet he was still human, flawed and imperfect. His shortcomings revealed the need for someone greater. A prophet who wouldn't just speak God's word but be it. A priest who wouldn't just enter God's presence but embody it. A leader who wouldn't just show the way but be the way. This is why Jesus was sent later, and with his arrival, hope was renewed. As Hebrew reminds us, Moses was faithful as a servant, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. And we are his house, if we hold firmly to our confidence and hope. And that is the story of Moses. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more insightful content like this.